Rain drummed on the roof of the small house on South 56th Street in the South End neighborhood of Tacoma for the third day in a row. Jessica Carter lay on the narrow bed in her childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling with yellow stains from leaks. At 35, she was living with her father again, like a teenager who couldn't find her place in the world. The sound of the alarm on her phone pierced the morning silence. It was 7:30 a.m., the time when she used to be on her way to work at Tacoma Construction Solutions, where she had been an accountant for almost 9 years. Now that sound was just a reminder that another day of fruitless job hunting and attempts to stretch her remaining savings lay ahead. Jessica got out of bed and looked out the window at the gray October day. Across the street, her neighbor Mrs. Chen was taking out the trash cans to the curb as usual. The ordinary lives of ordinary people with ordinary concerns. Jessica envied even this simple routine. She didn't have a job to create trash from packed lunches or documents. Going downstairs, she found her father at the kitchen table. Robert Carter, a former longshoreman at the port of Tacoma, now lived on a small pension and disability benefits after a back injury. The man was reading the local newspaper, the News Tribune, periodically shaking his head at the latest news about rising crime or business closures. "Good morning, Dad," Jessica said quietly, pouring herself coffee from an old coffee maker that had belonged to her mother. Bob looked up and nodded. In the 8 months his daughter had been living with him, he had learned not to ask unnecessary questions. He saw her sit down at the ancient computer in the living room every morning, send out resumes, and call about job listings. He saw her shoulders slump lower and lower every day, her gaze becoming more and more lost. "Meredith called last night while you were asleep," he said, without looking up from the newspaper. "She's inviting us to dinner on Sunday. She says Stan is going to make his famous ribs." Jessica froze with the cup at her lips. Meredith. Her younger sister, who never seemed to have any financial problems, who, after college, immediately found a good job at a regional food company, married a nice guy, and bought a house in a decent neighborhood in North End, where the yard didn't flood every time it rained hard. "I'll think about it," Jessica replied, even though she knew she would go. She was running out of money for groceries, and Meredith's refrigerator was always full of food. The day passed in the usual routine of rejections. 3 phone calls to employers who would consider her application and call back. No one ever called back. 2 resumes sent through online job search portals. 1 awkward conversation with a former colleague who tentatively promised to ask around. By Friday evening, Jessica was sitting in her old 2010 Honda Civic in front of Meredith's house on North Stevens Street. The 2-story house, with its neat lawn and freshly painted fence, looked like the embodiment of the middle-class American dream. A Pierce Transit bus was parked in the driveway. Stan sometimes took his work vehicle home on weekends for maintenance. Meredith greeted her sister at the door with a broad smile. At 32, she looked several years younger, as if her stable life had acted as a preservative. Her dark hair was neatly styled, light makeup accentuated her natural beauty, and her eyes radiated the confidence that comes with financial stability and a loving spouse. "Jess! How are you? Come on in. It's terribly damp outside." The house smelled of home comfort, a mixture of the aromas of cooking, fresh flowers, and that elusive scent of well-being that Jessica remembered from her childhood, before her family had encountered financial difficulties after her mother's death. Steen appeared from the kitchen, drying his hands with a kitchen towel. At 34, he had retained his athletic build despite his sedentary job as a driver. His short blonde hair, kind brown eyes, and easy smile made him the kind of man who inspired trust in passengers and love in wives. "Hi, Jessica. How are you?" There was no insincerity or pity in his voice, only genuine concern. Stan had always been a good guy, even when they met in college 12 years ago. Back then, Jessica was sure he was her future. She planned a wedding, children, a house in the suburbs. But life had other plans. Dinner took place in the traditional atmosphere of a family Sunday. Bob told stories about his work at the port, Meredith shared news from work, and Stan talked about funny incidents on his bus route. Jessica silently chewed on the delicious ribs and listened to her family living a normal life, with conversations about vacation plans and new furniture for the living room. "How's your job search going?" Meredith finally asked when the conversation naturally turned to Jessica. "It's difficult so far. The job market isn't great. Maybe you should think about retraining. IT specialists and marketers are in high demand right now." Jessica felt a familiar irritation rising in her chest. It's easy to talk about retraining when you have a stable salary, a husband with a steady job, and a house you can mortgage to get a loan for education. It takes time and money, which I don't have. An awkward silence hung in the air. Stan and Bob exchanged glances. Meredith smiled guiltily. "Of course I understand. I just want to help." After dinner, the sisters were left alone in the kitchen cleaning up. Bob and Stan went to the living room to watch football. The moment Jessica had both feared and anticipated had arrived. "Meredith, I need to talk to you." Meredith turned away from the dishwasher, a look of caution in her eyes. She knew her sister well enough to understand that this was going to be a serious conversation. "I'm in a really bad way financially. My savings are gone, and my unemployment benefits are about to run out. I don't even know how I'm going to pay for my car insurance next month." Jessica spoke quietly, but every word came with difficulty. Asking her younger sister for help was humiliating, but she had no choice. "I know this is a lot to ask, but could you lend me some money? Just for a couple of months until I find a job. I'll pay you back every penny." Meredith turned away toward the window, where raindrops were visible in the light of the kitchen lamp. The pause dragged on. When she finally turned back to her sister, her face showed her inner struggle. "Jess, I'd love to help, I really would. But things aren't so easy for us either. We're saving for a down payment on a bigger house, planning to have a baby. Stan wants to take out a loan for a new car. I'm not asking for much, $1,000 or $1,500. I know you can afford it. It's not about the money, Jessica." Meredith's voice took on a firmness that Jessica remembered from childhood. Her younger sister had always been stubborn. "The point is, you have to solve your own problems. I can't always bail you out." The word constantly hung in the air like a slap in the face. Jessica remembered past occasions, when Meredith had helped her with rent during her divorce 3 years ago, when she had lent her money to repair her car, when she had covered her share of the bill at her father's birthday dinner. "I always paid you back." "You did, but that's not the point. I think you rely too much on other people instead of taking responsibility for your own life." Those words hurt more than a direct refusal. Jessica felt her face burning with shame and anger. Take responsibility. Easy to say when your career is going well, when you're married to a reliable man, when life is going according to plan. "I understand," she replied curtly, putting on her jacket. "Thanks for dinner." The drive home took 20 minutes, but it felt like an eternity. Jessica drove through the sleeping city, where the light from televisions flickered in the windows of houses, and only occasionally did she see other cars on the deserted streets. Her sister's words kept spinning in her head. Take responsibility for your life. Meredith didn't understand. She never had. Everything had always come easily to her. Good grades in school, a scholarship to college, a job right after graduation. She even got Stina without much effort. She just showed up in their group, flashed her charming smile, and the guy Jessica thought was her future switched his attention to her younger sister. When she got home, Jessica sat in her car in front of her father's house for a long time, listening to the engine cool down. The light was on in the window. Bob was probably watching the late news before going to bed. The simple, predictable life of a retiree, now disrupted by the presence of his adult daughter who had failed to make something of herself. That night, Jessica couldn't sleep. Lying in her childhood bed, she stared at the ceiling and reminisced. Her memory stubbornly returned to the fall of 2013, when she was a junior at the University of Washington, Tacoma, majoring in accounting, and life seemed full of possibilities. At that time, she had been dating Stan Miller for 8 months. He was a sophomore studying education, planning to become a physical education teacher, but later switched to general studies. The tall, blonde guy with an open smile and calm demeanor seemed like the perfect partner to start a family with. They spent their evenings in his dorm room, studying together, planning their future, talking about how many children they wanted to have. Jessica remembered the day in October when Meredith first appeared on campus. She was only 18, a freshman majoring in marketing, and looked like the embodiment of student carefreeness. Long, dark hair that she constantly tucked behind her ear, laughter that could be heard across the hallway, and an ease in conversation that Jessica had always lacked. At first, everything was fine. Meredith occasionally joined their group when she came to visit her sister on weekends. Stan treated her kindly, as one should treat a girl's younger sister. But gradually, something began to change. Jessica noticed how Stan lingered on Meredith a little longer than usual, how he smiled at her jokes a little wider than he should have. The first alarm bell rang in November. Jessica came down with the flu and missed classes all week. Stan thoughtfully brought her lecture notes and homework assignments. On Friday, he said he was going to a student party at a nearby dorm and asked if she wanted to go. Jessica declined. She felt terrible and looked even worse. The next day, she learned from her roommate that Meredith had also been at the party. What's more, several people had seen her and Stan talking for a long time on the balcony, standing very close to each other. When Jessica asked Stan about it, he gave an evasive answer. He said that Meredith was looking for a senior student who could help her with her statistics coursework, and he was just giving her advice. Jessica believed him because she wanted to believe him. December brought exams and pre-Christmas hustle and bustle. Stan became less available, often saying he was busy preparing for exams or helping one of his friends. Jessica was too absorbed in her own studies to pay much attention to it. She planned to make the relationship official, to introduce Stan to her father during the Christmas break, maybe even move in with him after graduation. The truth came out on the first day of January 2014. Jessica returned to the dorm after the break and immediately noticed that the atmosphere had changed. Her neighbors on the floor avoided her gaze, and conversations stopped when she entered the room. Finally, her best friend Sarah decided to tell her. During the break, Stan and Meredith started dating. Officially. They didn't hide their relationship, holding hands on campus and kissing at the library entrance. Everyone knew except Jessica. The confrontation took place in the dorm cafeteria. Jessica saw them at a corner table. Stan was gently stroking Meredith's hand, and she was laughing at something he said. The same laugh that once delighted Jessica now grated on her ears like a saw on metal. "I need to talk to you," she said, approaching their table. Meredith turned pale. Stan looked up, and Jessica saw a mixture of guilt and determination in his eyes. "Jess, we were going to tell you." "When?" "After the wedding." The ensuing conversation was short and painful. Stan explained that a special understanding had developed between him and Meredith, that he hadn't planned it, but his feelings had proven stronger. Meredith cried and repeated that she never wanted to hurt her sister. Jessica listened to their excuses and felt something inside her break irrevocably. Not just her relationship with Stan, but her trust in her sister, her belief that those closest to her would never betray her. The rest of the school year passed in a blur. Jessica avoided places where she might run into the couple, focused on her studies, and shut herself off from her friends. Stan tried several times to talk to her, to explain, but she ignored his attempts. Meredith sent long apologetic messages, which Jessica deleted without reading. After graduation, Jessica got a job at Tacoma Construction Solutions and practically stopped communicating with her family for several years. She only saw them on major holidays, keeping her distance and acting cold. Meredith and Stan got married in 2018. Jessica attended the wedding because her father insisted, but she left immediately after the ceremony, citing poor health. Now, years later, lying in her childhood bedroom in her father's house, Jessica realized that the wound had never healed. It was just covered with a thin film of politeness and family obligations. On Monday morning, she was awakened by a call from her former colleague, Mike Rodriguez. "Jess, there's something. It's a temporary job, just for a couple of months. A small property management company is looking for someone to tidy up their books. The pay isn't great, but it's better than nothing." Jessica seized this opportunity like a lifeline. The job really was temporary and low-paying, only $22 an hour, 20 hours a week. But it was money that was enough for gas and minimal expenses. The office was located in an old shopping center on the south side of Tacoma. 3 small rooms reigned with chaos from unsorted documents, overdue bills, and accounting books that hadn't been updated in months. The owner, a nervous man named Derek Hughes, explained the situation in 5 minutes. "My previous accountant disappeared 3 months ago. Didn't answer her phone, didn't show up for work, nothing. She left a complete mess behind. I need someone to clean it up before the end of the year, or I'll have problems with the tax authorities." The work was tedious and depressing, but it gave Jessica a sense of purpose. Every day she came to the stuffy office, turned on the old computer, and slowly restored order to the financial records. Rent payments, utility bills, tax documents, everything had to be systematized and brought to a uniform standard. During her lunch breaks, she often went to the nearby McDonald's and watched people. Young mothers with babies in strollers, elderly couples sharing French fries, students poring over textbooks. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware of the gulf that separated them from homelessness. It was during one of these lunches that Jessica saw Meredith. Her sister was sitting in the corner of the room with a colleague, a pretty blonde in her mid-20s. They were laughing at something, looking at a tablet, probably discussing a work project. Meredith was dressed in an elegant business suit, her hair neatly styled, her face lightly made up, the embodiment of a successful businesswoman. Jessica watched her sister from behind a plastic palm tree, feeling a mixture of envy and curiosity. What is life like for someone who has everything going for them? Meredith ordered a salad and a Diet Coke. She was watching her figure. She talked to her colleague about her plans for the weekend, about a new restaurant she wanted to try with Stan. After Meredith left, Jessica sat in McDonald's for a long time, thinking. Somewhere in the back of her mind, an obsessive thought began to form. Why are some people lucky and others not? Why did Meredith get everything? A career, a husband, stability, while she, Jessica, had fallen to the bottom. In the days that followed, this thought would not leave her alone. Working with documents in a stuffy office, Jessica found herself thinking more and more about her sister's life. Where do they live now? How do they spend their evenings? What do they talk about at dinner? Do they make plans for the future? Her curiosity turned into obsession when Jessica discovered that she was passing Meredith's house on her way home from work. At first, it was accidental. She had simply chosen a different route to avoid traffic. But gradually, she began to make a detour on purpose. The house on North Stevens Street became the object of her intense attention. Jessica memorized details. When the lights came on in the windows, what time Stan came home from work, what cars were parked in the driveway. She learned that on Wednesdays, Meredith stayed late at work, and on Saturdays, she and Stan went shopping at Costco. This observation was not a conscious plan. Rather, it was a way to fill the void in her own life with other people's emotions and events. Jessica told herself that she just wanted to understand how people who were more fortunate lived. But with each passing day, the line between curiosity and obsession became thinner and thinner. Her temporary job was coming to an end. Derek Hughes was pleased with the results, but warned that he couldn't offer her a permanent position. Jessica was once again faced with the prospect of unemployment, only now with an even keener awareness of how fragile her situation was. The money from her temporary job helped cover her basic expenses, but it didn't solve the main problem. Her car insurance debt was growing, her father was hinting at the need to help with utility bills, and winter in Tacoma meant additional heating costs. One December evening, as she drove past Meredith's house, Jessica saw a scene of domestic bliss through the living room window. Her sister and Stan were sitting on the sofa, she reading a book, he watching television. Between them was the quiet intimacy that only comes with years of happy life together. Jessica stopped her car across the street and watched this scene for a few minutes. A wave of emotions rose in her chest: envy, loneliness, anger at the unfairness of life. Why had she never had anything like this? Why did Meredith get all the best things? It was at that moment that she realized that simply observing was no longer enough for her. She wanted more. To understand, to penetrate this life, to become part of it, or to destroy it. January in Tacoma was particularly harsh. Snow, a rarity in these parts, covered the city with a thin layer, turning the roads into a skating rink and utility bills into an unbearable burden for people with limited incomes. Jessica sat at her father's kitchen table with a stack of documents spread out in front of her. Bills, notices, letters threatening to cut off services. The house on South 56th Street, built in the 1960s, had never been known for its energy efficiency. The old windows let in the cold, the heater was working at full capacity, and the December electricity bill came to $380. For a retiree on a fixed income, this was a disaster. Bob Carter sat in his old chair in front of the TV, but Jessica could see him glancing sideways at her papers. The man tried to maintain his dignity and not ask direct questions about money, but the tension in the house grew with each passing day. "Dad, we need to talk," Jessica said, putting aside another notice from the insurance company. Bob turned down the TV and turned to his daughter. His eyes showed the fatigue and anxiety that had built up over many months of living with his unemployed daughter. "I know I'm creating extra expenses. Heating, electricity, water. Everything has become more expensive since I've been living here." The old man shook his head but did not deny the obvious. His pension and disability benefits barely covered the basic needs of one person, let alone two. It was then that Jessica first seriously considered that losing her apartment last June was only the beginning of her downfall. At the time, she still hoped that her unemployment was temporary, that in a month or two she would find a new job and be able to rent a place. 8 months later, it became clear that these were naive hopes. The apartment on South Tacoma Way was small, but it was hers. It was a studio for $850 a month in a neighborhood that couldn't be called prestigious, but where she could live peacefully. Jessica had rented it for 4 years, paid her rent regularly, and even made cosmetic repairs at her own expense. When she was laid off in April, she was sure it was a temporary setback. The construction industry had experienced downturns before, and Tacoma Construction Solutions had already gone through difficult times a year ago. But then it was limited to pay cuts and unpaid leave. This time it was more serious. The first month without work was spent actively searching and feeling optimistic. Jessica sent out resumes, went to interviews, and was confident that with her experience, she would find a job quickly. The second month brought the first signs of anxiety, but she was still able to pay the rent with her savings. The third month became critical. In June, when her landlord gave her an ultimatum, pay the $2,000 debt or vacate the apartment in a week, she had no choice. Jessica packed her belongings into boxes, loaded them into her car, and drove to her father's house with a simple request. "Can I stay with you for a few weeks until I find a job?" A few weeks turned into 8 months. Now, sitting at the kitchen table and calculating her expenses, Jessica realized she was trapped. Without a job, she couldn't rent a place. Without an address, it was harder to find a job. Without a steady income, it was impossible to save money for a deposit on a new apartment. It was a vicious circle with no way out. That evening, she drove to Meredith's house. It had become a habit. When her inner tension reached its peak, watching her sister's peaceful life brought a strange relief. It was as if someone else's well-being could fill the void in her own life. The house on North Stevens Street was buried in snow. The driveway had been neatly cleared, and cozy lights burned at the entrance. Silhouettes flashed in the living room windows, Meredith and Stan were spending a typical winter evening at home. Perhaps they were cooking dinner, watching a movie, planning their weekend. Jessica parked across the street and turned off the engine. The car quickly grew cold, but she was in no hurry to leave. Watching them was both comforting and irritating. On the one hand, she wanted to be part of that world, to have a home, a husband, stability. On the other hand, every minute spent watching reminded her of what she never had and probably never would have. Half an hour later, the light in the living room went out, but the light in the bedroom on the second floor came on. Jessica imagined Meredith and Stan getting ready for bed, talking about their day, making plans for tomorrow. The kind of marital intimacy that was unavailable to her. It was then that the thought first formed clearly in her mind. What if Meredith didn't have any of that? Jessica was frightened by her own thought and hurriedly started the car. On the way home, she tried to convince herself that it was just fatigue and stress, that it was normal to sometimes fantasize about changes in other people's lives. That envy was a natural human emotion. But deep down, she knew that something had changed. The line between passive observation and active desire was becoming increasingly blurred. February brought a new blow. Bob received a notice of an increase in property tax. The house he had bought in 1985 for $45,000 was now valued at $220,000. The annual tax rose from $800 to $1,300. "They're driving us, the ordinary people, out," said the old man, reading the documents. "The rich are buying up real estate, prices are rising, and we can no longer afford to live in the houses we built ourselves." Jessica knew her father was right, but that didn't solve their problem. Where could they get an extra $500 a year? With his income, that was a significant amount. That evening, she drove to Meredith's house again, but this time she didn't just watch from a distance. Parking in the alley behind the house, she walked through the backyard and looked into the kitchen window. Her sister was cooking dinner, humming something under her breath. Expensive food on the table, high-quality dishes, modern appliances, everything spoke of financial well-being. Stan was sitting at the kitchen island with his laptop, probably paying bills or planning purchases. Jessica stood in the shadows and felt a wave of rage rising inside her. Not just envy, rage. Why did they have the right to this life and she didn't? What did Meredith deserve more? Beauty? Luck? A willingness to take someone else's boyfriend? The sound of the door opening made her jump back into the bushes. Stan went out to the trash cans and took out a bag of garbage. Jessica held her breath, afraid he would notice her presence. But the man quickly returned to the house without even looking around. On the way home, Jessica thought about how easy it was to sneak into the yard, how vulnerable people were in their own homes. They lived without suspecting that someone might be watching them, studying their habits, planning to interfere in their lives. March brought a decisive conversation with Meredith. Her sister unexpectedly came to visit their father on Saturday morning while Jessica was still asleep. She woke up to the sound of voices in the kitchen. Meredith and Bob were having a serious conversation. "She can't live like this forever," Meredith said. "She needs to look for any job, not wait for the perfect one. She's trying. Every day she looks, calls, goes to interviews. Dad, she's been living with you for 8 months. She could have found something in that time. A cashier at a supermarket, a waitress, a cleaner, anything." Jessica quietly went down the stairs and stood in the kitchen doorway. Meredith was sitting with her back to her, but her tense posture showed that the conversation was not easy for her. "She's creating extra expenses for you. Utility bills have gone up, you need more groceries, and your pension isn't that big. We're getting by somehow. You're getting by for now, but what about later? What if you have health problems? What if the house needs repairs?" Jessica needs to take responsibility for her own life and stop being a burden on the family. The word burden sounded like a slap in the face. Jessica felt her face burning with humiliation and anger. "Maybe you're right," she said, entering the kitchen. Meredith turned around, her face red with embarrassment. Bob coughed awkwardly and turned away toward the window. "Jess, I didn't mean to. We were just discussing—" "No, you're right. I'm a parasite. I live off others and don't contribute to the family. Maybe I really should find a job as a cleaner or go wash dishes in a restaurant. You're misinterpreting my words. I understand perfectly. You've always thought you were better than me. In school, in college now. Everything comes easily to you, and I'm a failure who can't get her life together." Meredith stood up from the table, a metallic edge to her voice. "I don't think I'm better, but I work for my own well-being. I don't wait for someone else to solve my problems." "Work? You took my boyfriend and married him. That's your main job." "Stan was never yours. We fell in love, it just happened." "Of course, it just happened. Just like your career, your beautiful house, your perfect life. Everything just happened, and I'm just a loser who doesn't deserve anything." The conversation turned into shouting. Bob tried to intervene, to calm his daughters down, but the women didn't listen to him. Years of accumulated resentment, envy, and mutual grievances spilled out in a torrent of accusations and insults. "You've always been jealous," Meredith shouted. "Even as a child, you couldn't be happy for other people's successes. You were always comparing yourself to others, thinking you were being shortchanged. And you've always been selfish. You took everything you wanted without thinking about others. Money, parental love, every opportunity." The confrontation ended with the slam of the front door. Meredith left, promising not to return until Jessica apologized. Bob silently cleared the table, not looking at his eldest daughter. That evening, Jessica sat in her car across from Meredith's house and felt something inside her break completely. It wasn't just her relationship with her sister. It was something fundamental in her perception of the world and her place in it. She no longer wanted to just watch other people's happy lives. She wanted to take action. Over the next few weeks, Jessica's thoughts became more and more specific and dangerous. She studied Meredith and Stan's daily routine, memorizing when they left for work, when they returned, and what routes they took. She learned that on Thursdays, Stan worked the evening shift and didn't come home until midnight. That Meredith was often home alone on those days. Thursday, April 18th, 7:30 p.m. The house on North Stevens Street was shrouded in evening shadows. Stan had left for his evening shift at Pierce Transit half an hour ago, leaving Meredith alone. She knew his schedule by heart. Bus number 4, route through downtown to Lakewood, return at midnight. Meredith stood at the kitchen window watching the neighbor's cat hunting birds in her garden. It had been a stressful day at work, a new product presentation, a conflict with suppliers, overtime hours at the computer. At home, she could finally relax. The doorbell rang unexpectedly. Meredith glanced at the clock, too late for the mail or a delivery. Through the peephole, she saw a familiar figure. "What are you doing here?" The voice behind the door sounded tired and conciliatory. "I need to talk to you, please." Meredith hesitated. They hadn't spoken since the scandal in March. But there was a note of desperation in her voice that touched her heart. After all, she was her sister. She opened the door. The conversation began in the hallway. Apologies, explanations, attempts to mend relations. Meredith suggested they go to the living room and make some tea. She wanted to give family reconciliation a chance. "I know I behaved terribly," she heard her say. "Envy was eating me up inside." "It's not your fault," Meredith began to believe in the sincerity of her remorse. She relaxed and turned her back to put the kettle on. The blow landed at the base of her skull. A heavy metal candlestick from the kitchen table was the only thing at hand when the decision was made. Meredith fell without even having time to scream. The second blow was deliberate, and the third. By 8:15 p.m., the house on North Stevens Street was silent. Stan Miller returned home at 12:25 a.m., 25 minutes later than usual due to a bus breakdown on his route. He parked his company car in the driveway, as he always did on Thursdays. Tomorrow morning, he had to go to the depot for a scheduled technical inspection. The house greeted him with an unusual silence. Meredith usually didn't go to bed before he returned, leaving the light on in the hallway. Today, everything was dark. "Mer, I'm home!" Silence. Sten turned on the light in the hallway and saw a woman's handbag on the floor next to an overturned umbrella. His heart began to race. Meredith never left her things lying around. The light in the living room illuminated a scene that would change his life forever. Meredith was lying on the floor next to the sofa in an unnatural position, her hair matted with blood, her eyes wide open and staring at the ceiling. Next to her lay a massive wrought iron candlestick, a wedding gift from Meredith's aunt. Steen fell to his knees next to his wife and tried to find a pulse, even though he already knew it was too late. Her skin was cold, her body stiff. Meredith was dead. The 911 call came in at 12:31 a.m. The dispatcher could barely make out the man's words through his sobs. "My wife, she's dead. Someone killed my wife." The first patrol car arrived 8 minutes later. Officers Martinez and Johnson found Sten sitting on the porch in a state of deep shock. The man repeated one phrase, "I should have been home earlier." The house quickly filled with police officers. The crime scene was cordoned off with tape, and a preliminary investigation began. By 1 a.m., Detective Sarah Coleman arrived at North Stevens Street. The 41-year-old woman with 18 years of experience in the Tacoma Police Department knew that the first hours of a homicide investigation were critical. Over the years, she had seen enough family tragedies to understand that in most cases, the killer was someone close to the victim. Coleman examined the crime scene with professional thoroughness. There were no signs of forced entry, valuables were still there, and Meredith's wallet was in her purse with her money and credit cards intact. The murder took place in the living room, but the candlestick in the kitchen suggested that the crime was spontaneous. "It looks like she knew the killer," Coleman said to her partner, Detective Rick Thompson. "She voluntarily let him into the house, turned her back on him. She trusted him." The first interview with Stan was conducted at 2:15 a.m. in the living room of the neighbor's house. The man was still in shock, but he was able to give coherent answers to the main questions. "We were married for 6 years. No serious problems in our marriage. We were planning to have children. Meredith had no enemies. She worked as a marketer. Everyone loved her." Who else had access to the house? Her father, old Bob. Her sister, Jessica, but they had recently quarreled. Detective Coleman wrote the names in her notebook. Family conflicts are a common motive for domestic murders. "Tell me about the quarrel." Stan shrugged uncertainly. The details of his wife's family disputes had always been a mystery to him. "Something about money. Jessica lost her job and lives with her father. She asked Meredith for a loan and was refused. They had a big fight in March and haven't spoken since." By 3 in the morning, Detective Coleman had a preliminary picture of the crime. The murder was committed by someone known to the victim between 8 and 10 in the evening. The murder weapon was an object from the house, indicating spontaneity. The motive was unclear, but the family conflict needed to be investigated. The call to Jessica Carter came in at 3:45 a.m. The woman answered after the 4th ring, her voice sounding sleepy and irritated. "Hello? Jessica Carter? This is Detective Coleman from the Tacoma Police Department. I have some sad news to share with you about your sister." Pause. Then a sharp intake of breath. "What happened to Meredith?" "She died tonight. Murder. I need to meet with you to talk." The scream on the other end of the line was so piercing that the detective moved the phone away from her ear. Jessica was sobbing, asking incoherent questions, demanding to be taken to the crime scene immediately. "Who? How? Why? Oh my God, my little sister." Coleman scheduled a meeting for 8 in the morning at the police station. The woman needed time to compose herself and verify her alibi. By dawn, the picture began to clear up. Neighbors confirmed that around 7:30 a.m., They had seen an unknown woman entering the Miller's house. The description was vague: average height, dark clothing, hood over her head. There were no surveillance cameras in the area. Forensic technicians found several fingerprints on the front door and in the hallway, but preliminary analysis showed that they belonged to family members. No traces were found on the murder weapon. The candlestick had been thoroughly wiped down. At 8 in the morning, Jessica Carter showed up at the police station on South Tacoma Street. Red, swollen eyes, disheveled hair, trembling hands, the classic picture of a person in deep grief. She could barely stand on her feet and lost her balance several times on the way to the detective's office. "I can't believe she's gone," the woman sobbed. "We had a fight last time. We fought so stupidly over money, and now I'll never be able to apologize." Detective Coleman watched the victim's sister's behavior closely. Her emotions seemed genuine, but years of experience had taught her to be cautious. Killers are often good actors, especially when they kill people close to them. "Where were you yesterday between 7 and 11 p.m.? "At home with my father. We watched TV, then I went to bed early. I had a migraine all day." "Can your father confirm that?" "Of course. Call him." The alibi sounded plausible, but it needed to be checked. Coleman wrote down Bob Carter's address and phone number. "Tell me about your conflict with your sister." Jessica sniffed and wiped her eyes with a tissue. The story she told matched Stan's version: the request for a loan, the refusal, the argument over money and life principles. "Meredith thought I relied too much on my family, that I should solve my own problems. She was right, but it hurt to hear it." "Were you angry with her?" "Angry, yes, but not so much that, my God, how can you ask that? She's my sister." The new bout of sobbing seemed completely natural. If it was an act, it was masterfully performed. The interview lasted an hour. Jessica talked about financial difficulties, living with her father, looking for work. She painted a picture of her younger sister as a successful and loving woman who could not have had any enemies. She had the perfect life: a good job, a loving husband, plans for the future. Who would want to hurt her? After Jessica left, Detective Coleman made her first notes on the case. The victim's sister had a motive: financial problems and family conflict, but her alibi seemed solid, and her emotional reaction was consistent with that of an innocent person. By noon on Friday, the first leads had emerged in the case. Phone records showed that Meredith had received a call at 6:47 p.m. from a number registered to Jessica Carter. The conversation lasted 43 seconds. Coleman immediately contacted the suspect. "Yes, I called her," Jessica admitted. "I wanted to apologize for our argument." "To arrange a meeting, what exactly did you say?" "I asked if I could come over to talk." Meredith agreed, saying that Stina wouldn't be home until midnight so we could talk in peace. "But you didn't go?" "No. I changed my mind on the way. I decided I wasn't ready for a serious conversation. I turned around and went home." The story sounded unconvincing, but there was no direct evidence of deception. Additional evidence was needed. Bob Carter confirmed his daughter's alibi. The old man swore that Jessica had been home all evening, watching the news and a TV series together. But Detective Coleman noticed that the man looked nervous and avoided direct eye contact. By the end of the first day of the investigation, the picture remained unclear. Jessica Carter had a motive and opportunity, but her alibi and emotional reaction spoke in her favor. There were no other suspects yet. The case required a more in-depth study of the family history and a search for additional evidence. The breakthrough in the case came on the fourth day of the investigation, when Detective Coleman received surveillance footage from a Shell gas station at the intersection of South Tacoma Way and 72nd Street. The station was located 2 miles from Meredith's home, on a direct route from Bob Carter's home. The recording from April 18th at 7:12 p.m. clearly showed a 2010 Honda Civic with a license plate registered to Jessica Carter. The woman was filling up her car, and her face was caught on camera as she paid Recognizable features, the same jacket she wore during her police interview. So she was on her way to her sister's house at the exact time of the murder, Coleman said to his partner Thompson. And she told us she changed her mind and turned around on the way. Cell tower data confirmed the suspicions. Jessica's phone was registered in the North End area from 7:15 p.m. to 8:45 p.m. Then the signal moved back to the South End. Technical analysis showed that the device was within 3 blocks of the victim's home at the critical time. A second interrogation was scheduled for Monday, April 22nd. Jessica arrived accompanied by her appointed attorney, Michael Green, a young criminal defense lawyer from a legal aid organization. The woman looked exhausted, had lost weight, and had dark circles under her eyes. Miss Carter, we have video footage from the gas station where you filled up your car at 7:12 p.m. on your way to your sister's house. Detective Coleman began, placing a printout of the footage on the table. This contradicts your statement that you did not drive to Meredith's house. Jessica stared at the photos for a long time, her face gradually turning pale. Her lawyer whispered something in her ear, but she didn't respond. Cell tower data also shows that your phone was in the vicinity of the victim's home from 7:15 p.m. to 8:45 p.m. That's when the murder took place. I was there, Jessica said quietly. But I didn't kill her. The lawyer tried to stop his client, but she continued to speak as if a dam had burst. I came to apologize. I wanted to mend our relationship. We talked for about 20 minutes and everything was fine. Then I left, and she was alive. Then why did you lie during the first interrogation? I was scared. I realized that I would be the prime suspect if I admitted that I was there on the day of the murder. Detective Coleman studied the woman's face, trying to figure out if she was telling the truth. Years of experience told her that the suspect was trying to find a compromise between lying and telling the truth. Describe your meeting with your sister. Meredith let me in and we went into the living room. I apologized for the March quarrel and explained that jealousy had driven me crazy. She understood and forgave me. She said she also regretted her harsh words. How long did you stay in the house? 30 minutes, maybe a little longer. We even had tea in the kitchen. The story sounded plausible, but one fact contradicted it. Forensic experts found no evidence of tea drinking in the house. No dirty cups, no teapot, no other signs of tea drinking together. Miss Carter, no dishes were found in the kitchen that would indicate tea drinking. The sink was empty, the kettle was cold. Jessica blinked in confusion, trying to find an explanation. Maybe she cleaned everything up after I left. Meredith was always very tidy. In the 15 minutes between your departure and the killer's arrival, that's unlikely. The next 2 hours were spent in tense confrontation. The detective methodically examined every detail of Jessica's testimony, finding contradictions and inconsistencies. The lawyer requested a recess several times, but his client stubbornly continued her explanations, becoming more and more confused. The final blow came with the results of the DNA test, which arrived during the interrogation. Microparticles of skin that belonged to neither Meredith nor her husband were found under her fingernails. A quick analysis showed a match with Jessica's DNA sample. This means that the victim scratched the attacker during the struggle, Coleman explained. Your sister fought back. Jessica stared at the test results with glassy eyes. The lawyer tried to say something about the possibility of sample contamination, but it was too late. Enough, she said quietly. Enough lying. The confession took 40 minutes. Jessica talked about years of pent-up jealousy, about how losing her job and financial difficulties had driven her to despair, about obsessively watching her sister's life, about fantasizing about taking her place. I didn't plan to kill her. I really came to make peace, but when I saw her happy face, her cozy house, all her prosperity, something broke inside me. She turned her back to put the kettle on, and I saw the candlestick on the table. What happened next? I hit her. Once, then again. She fell and didn't move. I wiped the candlestick with a towel, made sure I didn't leave any fingerprints, and left. Did you plan to start a relationship with her husband? Jessica nodded without looking up. I thought Stan would need support, that we would grow closer in our grief. Silly, I know. The arrest took place on April 23rd at 4:30 p.m. Jessica Carter was charged with first-degree murder with aggravating circumstances. Bail was denied due to the severity of the crime. The news of the arrest shook the South End neighborhood. Bob Carter's neighbors couldn't believe that the quiet, unemployed woman they had known for years was capable of murdering her own sister. The local media picked up the story, turning it into a sensational tale of family envy and betrayal. Old Bob aged 10 years in the week after his daughter's arrest. He hired a more experienced lawyer, mortgaging his house to pay for the services, but he knew there was too much evidence against Jessica. Stan Miller took a leave of absence from Pierce Transit and hardly left the house. Neighbors saw him sitting on the porch for hours, staring into space. The man refused to be interviewed by journalists and avoided contact with the Carter family. The trial began on October 15th in Pierce County Superior Court. Prosecutor David Cheng presented the case to the jury as a classic example of how envy and financial difficulties can lead a person to murder a close relative. Jessica Carter watched her younger sister's successful life for years, accumulating resentment and anger, he said in his opening statement. When Meredith refused to give her money and called her a parasite, the defendant decided that if she couldn't have that kind of life, no one should. The defense, led by veteran attorney Robert Steele, attempted to portray the murder as the result of a temporary mental disorder caused by stress and depression. My client suffered from clinical depression for months. Losing her job, financial problems, and family conflict led her to a nervous breakdown. She was not in control of her actions at the time of the crime. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, video recordings, cell tower data, DNA analysis, and neighbor testimony. Stan gave emotional testimony about his wife, her character, and their plans for the future. The most dramatic moment was Jessica's own testimony. The woman spoke about her feelings toward her sister, about the envy that had been eating away at her for years. I loved Meredith, but I hated her at the same time, she said through tears. I hated her because everything came easily to her, while nothing worked out for me. Because she took Stan when we were young. Because she lived the life that should have been mine. A psychiatric evaluation found no signs of serious mental disorders. Jessica understood the nature of her actions and was able to control her behavior. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. The verdict was unanimous: guilty of second-degree murder. The jury found no evidence of premeditation, which ruled out first-degree murder, but recognized the presence of intent at the time of the crime. On November 26th, Judge Margaret Holland handed down the sentence: 25 years in prison without the possibility of parole for the first 15 years. This crime is particularly heinous because it was committed against a loved one for base motives, the judge said. Envy is no excuse for taking the life of an innocent person. Jessica was sent to the Washington Correction Center for Women in Gig Harbor. During the first months of her imprisonment, she received letters from her father, but gradually the correspondence ceased. Bob Carter died of a heart attack in February of the following year. Neighbors said that the old man could not survive the shame and loss of both daughters, one physically, the other morally. The house on South 56th Street was sold to pay off debts. The buyer demolished the old building and built a modern duplex on the site. A year after his wife's murder, Stan Miller transferred to the bus depot in Olympia. Colleagues said he was never the same again. He became withdrawn, rarely smiled, and avoided talking about his personal life. He never remarried. The Jessica Carter case became a subject of study in criminology circles as an example of how family jealousy and financial difficulties can lead to fatal consequences. Local social services used this story to train employees to recognize signs of domestic violence and family conflicts. The North End neighborhood where the murder took place restored its reputation as a quiet family place, but the house on North Stevens Street stood empty for a long time. New owners moved in only 2 years later, after extensive renovations and a change of address. The story of Meredith and Jessica Carter served as a reminder of the fragility of human relationships and how quickly love can turn to hate and family ties can become a motive for crime.